The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to St. Matthew. The 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain to which Jesus had ordered them. When they all saw him, they worshipped, but they doubted. Then Jesus approached and said to them, "All power in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. And behold, I am with you always until the end of the age." The Gospel of the Lord. Morning, everyone. The first words that people say in great pieces of literature are pretty important. If you're reading a book about somebody, or if you're reading a book and the author has the key character appear, the first words he or she says are pretty important. I've said this before here. Well, that's true for the great books in the Bible, too. What's the first words that Moses speaks? What are the first words that Abraham speaks? What's the first words a human being speaks? Eve. What's the first words that Jesus speaks? They're pretty important. Now, we have 4 books about Jesus, and Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John record the first words that Jesus speaks, and they're different in each book. In St. John's Gospel, Jesus finally appears on the scene, and Jesus is walking around, and all of a sudden he notices people following him, and he kind of turns around and he sees them. Off he goes, he walks a little bit more, and he turns around and he sees them again. And Jesus keeps walking, and then finally he can't take it anymore, and in John's Gospel he turns around and he looks at these people, and these are the first words Jesus speaks in John's Gospel. What are you looking for? It's like, what are you looking for in life? Why are you following me? Pretty cool words. Luke wrote a gospel about Jesus, and Luke has stories that John didn't have, and Matthew didn't have, and Mark didn't have. And one of these stories that Luke has is when Jesus is 12 years old, and he's in Jerusalem for this big feast day. And he's a 12-year-old boy. So at the end of the feast, probably, Joseph figures that he's still a 12-year-old boy. He's going to travel home with the women. And Mary figures, well, he's a 12-year-old boy now, so he's probably going to be traveling home with the men. And when they finally team up later in that day, they look at each other and they basically say, "We have a problem, Houston." And Mary says, "Well, I thought he was with you." And Joseph says, No, I thought he was with you. And they go back to Jerusalem, and 3 days later they find him. And they go into the temple, and they're kind of wagging their fingers at him. And Mary says, "Why did you do this to us?" And these are the first words Jesus says as a 12-year-old boy in Luke's Gospel. "Did you not know that I had to be about my Father's business?" A little precocious, if you ask me. But did you not know that I had to be about my Father's business? I had to be in my Father's house. And it's interesting, at 12 years of age, Jesus is able to articulate this unique relationship that he has with God. He calls God his Father, Abba. Well, the last words that people speak are also important. And if anybody has ever been in the presence of a person dying, and if you've heard their last words, they're pretty powerful. In the gospel today, we hear the last words that our Master spoke while he was on planet Earth. These are the last words Jesus spoke while he was on planet Earth. He calls all of his disciples together. They're on a mountain, and Jesus says about 2 or 3 sentences, but I just want you to remember 4 words that he spoke. Go and make disciples. These are the last words Jesus speaks. Go and make disciples. There's only 4 words, so why don't we say them together? Go. Great. Once more. Good. If you can remember anything from this homily, just remember those 4 words and I'll be very happy. So what happens here? All the disciples are gathered there, and let's start with the basics. Jesus is talking to all disciples. Jesus says, you. He's talking to all of his disciples. Notice what he doesn't do. Jesus doesn't call Peter off to the side. He doesn't put his arm around Peter, and he says, you know what, Peter? You get it. So I want only you to make disciples of all the nations. He doesn't say that. Jesus says, you make disciples. All my disciples are supposed to make disciples. Notice what Jesus does or doesn't do. He doesn't call his mother over and say, Mother, you really get it. I'm going to ask you and only you to disciple everybody in the world. Jesus doesn't say that. Jesus gives this command, go and make disciples to all people, to you and to me, to all Christians. Okay. You and I, but you are in the business of disciple making. That's what Jesus says. So Jesus says, you, all Christians. Next, Jesus says go. Go is a command. It's a direct command. Jesus says go. Jesus doesn't say, would you mind? Jesus doesn't say, I know you're busy, but. Jesus doesn't say, I hope it's not too much of a burden. Jesus says, go. It's a command. It's a direct order. And if Jesus Christ, the Son of God, says go, we have no right to say no. Really. If he says go, we can't say no. And we say no in lots of different ways. I'm too busy. Oh, that's what the priests do. That's what Deacon Lou does. That's why we hire people. These are all ways of saying no when Jesus says go. It's a direct command, friends. Jesus says go. And if Jesus says go, we have no right to say no. Okay. Next, he says make. Now, I know this is weird language, make disciples and disciple making. This is not the language Catholics use, which says something because it's in the Bible. It's the last thing Jesus says before he sends into the heavens. Jesus says, go and make disciples. It's not the language that we use as Catholics. We use things like going to Mass on Sunday. We talk about going to a Catholic school or going to a CCD program. We Catholics talk about getting the sacraments. And all of them are important. We talk about the Pope and the Vatican. But the most important thing is when Jesus says, go and make disciples. That's the mission of the church. Making disciples. And all of us are supposed to make disciples. So, making is an action verb. Make disciples. It implies that there's a beginning, that there's an end, a middle, sorry. There's an end, and it's a process. And there's something you do to other people. Jesus says, go and make disciples. I mean, that's what we have to be doing as Catholics. We need to make disciples. And, and I shared some of this information last week. Our country needs us to make disciples. Last 2-3 weeks ago, the Pew Foundation in Philadelphia revealed some statistics, some interesting statistics about the religious landscape in the United States. And it's kind of depressing, you know. For every one person who joins a Christian church in the United States, 4 are leaving. In the last 7 years, the percentage of Americans who consider themselves Christians have shrunk by 8%. There are about 300 million people in America. There's about 300 million people in America. 100 million of them are baptized Catholics. 100 million are baptized Catholics. 30 million of them are no longer part of the church. They're ex-Catholics. 30 million out of 300 million is 1 out of 10. 1 out of every 10 Americans is an ex-Catholic. Okay? We need to do something about this. Whatever we're trying doesn't seem to be working. You know, maybe we need to think differently. And the church that has the largest number of people leaving it is the Catholic Church. So we need to get about and make disciples. Okay? We need to evangelize. That's another way of saying it. You know, or we need to be missionaries. When Catholics are asked, okay, what questions do you have about making disciples or sharing your faith or evangelize? The number one question that Catholics always ask is, how? How? Now, there's no one way. There's lots of different ways that we, as Catholics, can disciple other people and help them to become followers of Jesus Christ. I tell you what the answer is not, let's get them into that RCIA program. No. It's, 10 people in the parish are not supposed to be the disciple makers. Catholics are the disciple makers. And a parish exists to inspire you and to equip you to go out and make disciples. You know, if my father was living, and if he was sitting here, he'd be looking at me saying, Jimmy, what are you talking about? Because my dad just went to Mass on Sunday. That's what Catholics do. If my mom was here, she'd be saying the same thing. So I know it's different. I know this language is different, but this is the mission of the church, to make disciples. It's the mission of our parish. So if the disciples said to Jesus, how do I make disciples? Jesus would say, well, why don't you do what I did to make you disciples? And if you read the Gospels, what did Jesus do to disciple people? He ate with them. Okay? He took them along when he visited the sick. That's not very difficult. No? Jesus built into them and told them he loved them and encouraged them when they were kind of downtrodden. That's not very hard. When the time was right, Jesus prayed with people. And Jesus looked for opportunities to talk about spiritual things. That's how you can make disciples at work and in your neighborhoods. The people who most know what it means to make disciples are parents. Okay, parents want to share their faith with their children. So parents have this DNA to make disciples, to go and make disciples. But we just can't make disciples of our children now. We need to think differently. We need to disciple other people outside of our families, people that we know, or sometimes within our families. So anyway, so Jesus just has those 4 words, go and make disciples. And, the word disciple, it's just a follower of Jesus Christ. It's a person who tries to do what Jesus did in his life. Anyway, that's the last 4 words Jesus says. It's the mission of our church. Everything we do as a parish needs to be evaluated against that standard. But our parish, the church doesn't evangelize. Catholics evangelize. So this is personal evangelization. You have to make disciples. As the pastor here, I'm going to try to help the parish to equip you. But I can't do that work for you, and no one else can either. Okay? Who discipled you? If all of you were here today at 12 o'clock on a Sunday, someone must have discipled you, or multiple people must have discipled you. And then hopefully the way they discipled you, you can disciple other people. So, last words Jesus speaks today, go and make disciples. And I think we need to get our head around this. And, it's the mission of the church. It's our mission. So I think if we're trying to be faithful to it, God's going to bless us.